So good evening to you all. I must say I'm very encouraged by the number of people. I had visions of it being quite a small gathering from when Dave invited me. To see something close to 40 people here really makes it feel extremely worthwhile for me. I'd like to thank Dave for the invitation, but especially I'd like to thank the church for actually allowing me to be here, because it's an enormous privilege. I've travelled a long way. I live down in the Cotswolds, so I've had about a 3 3/4 hour drive to get up here. My name is Paul Clark. Are any of you Red supporters rather than blue?
No.
The only other time I have been to Liverpool was in 1995, when a very dear friend of mine actually got tickets for a quarter-final of the FA Cup when Liverpool were at home to Spurs. I don't know if any of you remember back that far, but it was a fantastic game of football which Spurs actually won 2-1, a goal from Jurgen Klinsmann in the last couple of minutes. But the reason I'm telling you the story is it was one of the most sobering experiences of my life. Nothing to do with me speaking this evening, but when I looked at the memorial plaque of the names of the 98, one of the names on there is Paul Clark. And there is no E either, which is how my name is spelled as well. So my only other visit was quite a sobering experience. So I come from the Cotswolds. I'm a retired accountant, officially, but I'm told there is no such thing as a retired accountant, and I still do books and tax returns and all sorts for various people. I have been to the so-called Holy Land 4 times before I went as an EA, but those trips were never more than 2 weeks. Going as an EA was an altogether different experience because, as this might tell you here, I was actually there for 3 months between April and July of 2016. Sorry, I don't know if that was somebody coming in. No. Most significantly of all, I would like you to understand one thing about me, which is fundamental to understand who I am as a person. Technically, I am Jewish. Although I have come to a Christian faith, my grandmother on my father's side was a full Jewess. And that meant I grew up believing with a passion that one of the most significant events in modern history was the creation of Israel in 1948. And in many ways, I still believe that now. I actually still believe the Jews are God's chosen people. So just bear in mind, as I'm talking, that underlays all I am saying. So I went with an organisation called the Ecumenical Accompanies Program in Palestine and Israel. Bit of a mouthful, isn't it? But I have to say, most people know the organisation as EAPPI. Those of you who know anything at all about us will recognise readily the name EAPPI. The people who go are called Ecumenical Accompaniers. But again, we are normally known as EAs. So if I talk about EAPPI or I talk about an EA, hopefully you will know readily what I mean. I do not in any way want to talk down to any of you, but I just feel I need to explain that Israel, in inverted commas, is shown here on this map. But one of the great difficulties is my understanding is that Israel has never actually defined its borders. It is still to do that. But here we have the West Bank, which is notionally at least Palestinian, and here we have the Gaza Strip, which is occupied by approximately 1 3/4 Palestinians. But the two together are known as the occupied territories, are known as Palestine. Difficulty in the West Bank. I don't want to go into lots of detail about areas A, B and C and stuff. Many of you will know about that. But fundamentally, 60% of the West Bank is actually completely controlled by the civil authority and the Israeli Defense Force. Namely, it's controlled by the Israelis. Other distinctions exist in areas A and B, but this is not the place to go into those kind of distinctions. Dave? Sorry. I want to explain though, EAPPI have a number of placements on the West Bank which are filled each time, and there is one placement in East Jerusalem. Because of my Christian commitment, I had the huge privilege of being in East Jerusalem. But it meant that my placement was Jerusalem. But if you have a picture in your mind, say of, I presume Liverpool is probably similar, but if you were in central London and you had the City Mile, they call it, that's central London. You might make the mistake of thinking that I was in an area like that, where you see the old city and Jerusalem city centre, West Jerusalem, which is Israeli. But I was not just in the old city and West Jerusalem. I was operating in what is called the Jerusalem Governorate, which is a bit like Greater London round the City Mile. And it meant that fundamentally I was travelling from places like up close to Ramallah in the north and close down to Bethlehem in the south. Very large area, and it gave me a huge amount of travelling to do. Come with me, if you will, to a Bedouin community, a place called Jabal al-Baba. I don't know if any of you know what Jabal al-Baba means, but it means the Pope's Mountain. It's a really beautiful place, high up on a hill, and it is land which is owned by the Vatican, who have entrusted the safety of this land to the Bedouin. You see the animal, the goats and the sheep running around. You see relatively poor places that they live in. And if you're honest, you might say to yourself, I couldn't live there. And maybe I couldn't either. But that's not my choice, is it? Any more than it's your choice. We met with their leader, Atala. A lovely, lovely man. You would be impressed by his intellect and his integrity. You realise he cares deeply about his people, and he invites you to share with him the customary tea and coffee, which happens in every Bedouin community. But Atala tells you that the future of his people is under considerable threat of forcible transfer. The Israeli government want to take their land to further expand the larger Israeli settlement called Male Adumim, which is only a short distance away. From the heart I ask you, should the future of the Bedouin at Jabal al-Baba be threatened in this way? Simply because all they want to do is to continue their chosen semi-nomadic lifestyle? Come with me also to another Bedouin community at Abu Nuwar. It is found nestled between two Israeli settlements. One is Male Adumim, which I already mentioned, and the other Kedar, in the occupied West Bank. They are yet another Bedouin community under considerable threat. Through our translator, we learn from their leader there, Abu Imad Bisat, that the Israeli government is trying to force a relocation plan on all Bedouin communities and to make them move into townships. Does it ring a bell somewhere? Back in South Africa? It strongly reminds me of what the British did to the Aborigines some 200 years ago. And what about what happened to the native Indians in the USA around the same time? But hasn't the world woken up to how appalling this kind of behaviour is? Also, at no stage have the Bedouin communities ever been consulted in this process. Furthermore, a UN study has clearly shown that such transfers are not socially nor economically viable. I ask Abu Imad how he sees their future. He startles me by using one word: dark. Says it all. Previously, I had asked Abu Khamis, the leader at yet another Bedouin community called Khan al-Amar, what it would be like for them to be forced into townships. He replied, "This is like Guantanamo to the Bedouin." Just some pictures of the settlement at Kedar. And then if these settlements continue expanding, the West Bank will be cut in half, and East Jerusalem will become completely encircled by settlements. At a meeting with the UN, an official described the Bedouin to me as the human face of the two-state solution. If the Bedouin lose their case, the two-state solution will be dead. If it isn't already, I ask myself. Listen to the words of Mohammed al-Korshan in a report to the UN in 2011. There is very little awareness, both in our region and worldwide, of the critical situation that the Bedouin in the West Bank are experiencing. Over 62 years of exile, we have striven to keep alive our traditions, customs and hopes. Now all this is irremediably at risk of disintegration and collapse. It is of crucial importance for us to seek the support of the international community. That's us folks. The settlements, for the sake of clarity, there are 225 Israeli settlements built on the wrong side of the separation barrier. Many of you will know what I mean by the separation barrier, some may not, I'm not sure. But Israel has built a wall about 750 kilometres long. In the process, unfortunately, it has not gone on the green line as it was supposed to. The line of armistice in 1967, it is stealing a lot of Israeli water. Sorry, it is stealing a lot of Palestinian water. It is stealing quite a lot of really good Palestinian agricultural land. But on the wrong side of that barrier, there are 750,000 Israeli settlers living. So the wall is for security. Yeah. Such settlements are illegal under Article 49 of the Fourth Geneva Convention, which prohibits an occupying power from transferring parts of its own population into the territory it occupies. So, to a change of subject. Return with me now, if you will, to the Bedouin community at Jabal al-Baba. In mid-May, when I was there, the Israeli military arrived at 5 o'clock in the morning. The occupants were given 1 minute to empty their homes. The homes were then either demolished or dismantled. Okay. As we arrived, the confiscated humanitarian materials, which were part of an aid package from the UN, are being driven away. You can see here a low loader with a lot of dismantled sort of metal structure type home and a whole convoy of Israeli military vehicles. A total of 49 people, including 22 children, lost their homes that day. UN coordinator Robert Piper condemned this action, saying, despite the obligation on Israel under international law to facilitate rapid and unimpeded passage of relief to those who need it, humanitarian relief to vulnerable communities like Jabal al-Baba is increasingly under attack. Once again, we call on Israel to respect the rights of these vulnerable communities and to leave these households in peace. The thing that hit me by far the hardest when I was in Israel and Palestine were the house demolitions. One day we had a call asking us to go to Shuafat village, where at 5:30 in the morning Rajay Hawarian's family were given 5 minutes to leave their home. It was then completely destroyed. I asked Rajay, a paramedic, which you might see from his uniform, why his home had been demolished. He walked me just down the road to a junction. He pointed one way to an Israeli settlement. He turned 180 degrees, pointed to another Israeli settlement and said they're going to build a road between these two settlements and my home is in the way. He tells me, this is the face of the occupation. It has many faces, but I hope your countries will see this one. We are invited to what was the Ghanem family home in Wadi al-Jawz. Karama, the wife, wanted to thank us for all the help we gave her when her home was demolished. I asked her why it was demolished, and she said to make way for an Israeli nature park. 3 times in my duties as an EA, I was invited to share the food and drink in the rubble of demolished homes. I felt completely overwhelmed. Sometimes Palestinian hospitality is received at times you least expect it, and in the most terribly difficult circumstances. We go to the house of Younes Taye in Silwan. They have a demolition order on an extension to their home. They could neither afford the fine, which would go with it, nor the charges for demolition, because if you live in East Jerusalem, you are actually charged for the demolition. So they made the very difficult decision to self-demolish. So why have so many homes that have been demolished not had proper Israeli building permits? Well, the simple reason is that they are incredibly expensive to get. And 95.5% of applications are rejected anyway. In Anata, the Golani family ran a thriving garage business. Israeli bulldozers tore it apart at 3 o'clock in the morning. The livelihood of 7 men who worked there was put in jeopardy. And to make matters worse, 5 customers' cars were badly damaged. Ashraf Golani told me he would have to pay substantial compensation, and yet there was no demolition order on this business. The same bulldozers, my mouth is just going very dry. Sorry about that. The same bulldozers moved to the Bedouin community at a place called Anata. There they demolished 7 family homes and 4 animal pens. But I don't know if you can see, in this one, there are some personal belongings in the demolished home, because they were given no time at all to empty their homes. Worse, the Bedouin community were really angry because 2 years before, the Israeli courts had actually issued stop orders on the demolition orders that had previously existed. And those stop orders were still in place when the military arrived and demolished these homes. The very next day, we were called to a place called Jabal al-Mukabir, where we met Amr Awisat. He and his wife had ploughed everything they had into building their first home together. But now it was gone, and there was no demolition order. He says, "It is the occupation, but we have to continue our lives." Article 53 of the Fourth Geneva Convention prohibits the destruction of personal property by an occupying power, except where it is absolutely necessary for military reasons. I unashamedly tell you, I attended dozens and dozens. This is just a small example of the house demolitions I went to. I attended dozens. But there wasn't one of those where I saw any possible military reason for it happening. I also think that if it had happened back here in the UK, there would have been some kind of process. If a new estate was being built, or a new road, or a new national park, or whatever it might be, there would be a consultation period. There would be maybe a compulsory purchase, but usually with that there is some kind of agreed compensation. Absolutely none of that happens with the Palestinians. Also, while I was away, I did have the huge privilege of spending some time up in Haifa, visiting a Reform synagogue. One evening, a Jewish family extended some wonderful hospitality to me. 2 of the sons were serving in the Israeli military. But I was shocked and amazed to find that they knew nothing about the kind of demolitions that I'd been attending. The only demolitions they knew about were what are called punitive demolitions, where someone in a family, a Palestinian family, has committed a really bad act. It is normal practice to actually destroy the family home. Now, you have to make up your own minds whether you think that's right in itself. I know how I feel. But that was the only kind of demolition the 2 soldiers knew about. Just briefly, look at some recent statistics. These were as I was leaving Jerusalem. At the bottom, in the whole of 2015, there were 453 demolitions. By the end of July, when I left, there had already been 614. And in terms of people, the whole of 2015, 580 people had been displaced. By the end of July, that figure was 919. And believe me, I know from other returned EAs that those demolitions continued unabated after I left. And I apologise to you all, this is a very, very brief bit of history. I could come under considerable criticism for not adding this, that or the other. But I just want to highlight to you that in 1948, the UN had established a partition plan which was actually never enacted. I don't know if you know that, but the actual partition plan itself was not enacted. But nonetheless, the Zionist movement created the State of Israel, and 750,000 Palestinian refugees resulted. In 1967, tensions rose. Israel launched a preemptive strike and occupied Gaza, the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, and the Golan Heights. the occupation began still exists today, 50 years ago this year. But in 2002, after a call from the Jerusalem churches, the World Council of Churches created a human rights monitoring program called EAPPI. In this country, just for clarification, I would like to mention that because they had a lot of experience already in the field of human rights monitoring, responsibility was actually delegated to the Quakers. So my selection and training actually came under the Quakers. That is formally under the WCC, the World Council of Churches. Today, 2017, Israel still controls all the borders into the West Bank and Gaza, and the occupation of the West Bank continues unrelenting. Furthermore, those 750,000 Israelis have now made their home on the West Bank and in East Jerusalem. And I would just like to say to you, in my opinion, the work of Ecumenical Accompaniers, EAs, is still as vital today as it has ever been, maybe even more so. Having said the above, I think it's really important that you understand what underlays EAPPI, EAPPI. Principled impartiality, it's called. It's not an easy term to describe, but I've endeavoured to put my own words to it by saying, we do not take sides in this conflict, and we do not discriminate against anyone. But we are not neutral in terms of principles of human rights and international humanitarian law. We are neither pro-Israeli nor pro-Palestinian, but rather are pro-human rights and international humanitarian law, working for an end to the occupation and a just peace with security and dignity for all. As a human rights monitor there, one of my roles was to stand at checkpoints. We used to get there at 4:30 in the morning, so imagine what time we had to be up and get ourselves ready. But we were there to monitor Palestinians going through Calandia checkpoint, in our case, if any of you know Calandia. But it was Palestinians trying to get to their places of work or to their land, many of whom the barrier has separated their homes from the land that they own and that they farm, or their places of education or medical facilities, or possibly to a place of worship like Al-Aqsa Mosque, for example. EAs also offer what is called a protective presence. I don't want to give an impression that we went around carrying submachine guns or anything like that. The jacket was significant. But often we would have a call, a shepherd or a farmer or children going to school. We would be asked to try and be with them as they went about either their work or to their place of education, because unfortunately many of them were the subject of some quite serious violence from Israeli settlers. But I want to be clear, we not only had the privilege of working with Palestinians, we also had the huge privilege of working with Israeli peace activists. I don't know if any of you heard of a very famous group called the Women in Black. Every Friday afternoon they meet in the centre of Jerusalem and they hold these banners. It was the only place that we as EAs were allowed to actually stand with them and hold the banners. But also we were allowed to stand and monitor other Israeli peace activists, like this one at a place called Sheikh Jarrah in Jerusalem. I unashamedly say to you all, there were times when I greatly admired the courage of these Israelis. I saw them sworn at in the most horrendous way sometimes. I saw them have drinks thrown over them. and worse, I saw them spat on by their own countrymen. And the same was true when we met with some other Israeli peace activists. Many of you may know of an organisation called EAPPI, the Israeli Commission Against House Demolitions, and also an incredible group of people called Breaking the Silence. Former Israeli military who have come out and spoken about what they were ordered to do, for example, on the West Bank, which they found abhorrent and need the world to know. Breaking the Silence appear now to have become public enemy number one in Israel, unfortunately. Occasionally, I'm ashamedly say to you, I got really down. There were times when we were very badly intimidated by Israeli settlers, sticking cameras in our faces, trying to follow us, calling us Nazis. If there's one thing I'm certainly not, it's a Nazi. Telling lies about us on Facebook. Sometimes we were seriously harassed by the Israeli soldiers and police. At one time I was warned it looked as though I was about to be arrested, but fortunately that didn't happen. But sometimes I cried. One of my colleagues caught me at this house demolition. I tried to walk away, and because the tears were just flowing down my face. But much of that stuff can seem really negative. Here I am at a Bedouin school called the Bamboo School. I don't know if anybody else has ever been there, but it's a school made out of bamboo rather than bricks and mortar, in a hope that might prevent the demolition of the school. But it reminds me that there is real hope still even today. From my heart, I tell you what a huge, huge privilege it was for me to wear this vest. The EAPPI call it a vest, but we were told clearly by the UN that the Palestinians call us the jackets. And it was a term of endearment, not of anything else. They always acknowledged the jackets. Sometimes I was on a bus. A Palestinian came up to two of us with a bag of cakes and said, "Would you like a cake?" Why? Because you are EAPPI.
Really?
A man came out of a shop and asked if he could shake my hand. I said, why? Because you are EAPPI. A man at Calandia checkpoint said, one morning when I was so down, I can't tell you how down I was seriously thinking about coming back. And this man came up to me at 6:30 in the morning when I was as miserable as sin, and he asked if he could shake my hand. And I just knew then that God was encouraging me that day to carry on, to persevere. And why did he want to do it? Because I was EAPPI. One day I saw this little lad in the old city, and I thought about his future. I saw his happy, smiling face and thought, if his dad will let me, I've got to capture this. And his dad just looked at my jacket and he said, yes, that's fine. So my mind went back to the Bedouin community at Jabal al-Baba. Within 48 hours of the house demolitions I'd mentioned earlier, they were filled with hope again. And they were actually starting to rebuild the homes that they had lost. Atala, the leader at Jabal al-Baba, who I introduced you to earlier, told me about some 12-year-old children who had attended his community summer school. They had been asked to share their dreams. I appreciate they were only 12, but they were asked to do it in both Arabic and in English. Now, I don't know if you can read this, the English at the bottom or not. It says, I dream to go to the university and study law so I can build a house without being destroyed from the occupation. That's a 12-year-old Bedouin lad. So as I start to wind up, think it important I go back to my Christian faith. And I share with you a few scriptures that actually caused me to go to Palestine and Israel as an ecumenical accompanier. In the Old Testament, there are many verses that call the Jews to welcome strangers and to bring justice to all. That wonderful verse in Amos chapter 5. Let justice roll down like waters and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream. On the separation barrier in Jerusalem, you can see it painted there like this. Some of you may have heard of an American author, American Jew, by the name of Mark Braverman. His words: the prophets Isaiah and Jeremiah would have voiced unrelenting protest against Israel's brutal occupation of Palestine. But the Old Testament on its own can never be enough for me or those of you who are Christians who are present. It is the teachings of our Lord Jesus Christ that must matter most to us. And I think of those incredible words in Matthew chapter 25. All the nations will be gathered before him. They will answer, Lord, when did we see you hungry or thirsty or a stranger or needing clothes or sick or in prison and did not help you? He will reply, I tell you the truth, whatever you did not do for the least of these, you did not do for me. Then they will go away to eternal punishment. I don't want to preach at you. I am not an expert in theology. But I worked for Bible Society for 23 years, but as an accountant. And I heard a debate raging for years whether a Christian could lose their salvation or not lose their salvation. But I do believe here Jesus is warning us that we can lose our salvation if we do not behave towards others as he would expect us to have done. So, as I conclude, I would just like to say that at the back as you go out, if you're interested, there are some leaflets about EAPPI. There is also a sort of an action sheet about witnessing, engaging or seeking change. Make of that, if you want a copy of it, what you will. But it refers to things like inviting EAs like myself to speak to communities of all kinds. Maybe visiting Israel and Palestine for yourselves and seeing what it's all about. Maybe even thinking about being an ecumenical accompanier yourself. Staying informed, social media, useful websites, useful books. Prayer and giving. That's entirely up to you. But also seeking change through your elected representatives and such. I have to say I've tried desperately to speak to my MP with no joy whatsoever. He's frozen me out. But I have had the great success in speaking to 2 MEPs in separate meetings. How much longer their influence will have any impact, of course, is another matter altogether. But nonetheless, I was very encouraged by both of those meetings. I will deliberately, as long as I can find the piece of paper, just share with you a last thing. When I was in Jerusalem, somebody gave me a poem because they really held in high esteem the Ecumenical Accompaniers. I'm sorry, I cannot offer you coffee. My house has been demolished. We stand together, family and supporter, accompanied and accompanier. The bulldozer drives away. The soldiers depart laughing and joking, which sadly I saw rather more often than I would like. Leaving a pile of rubble, a storehouse of shattered memories, here and there remembered objects, the black t-shirt, the embroidered cushion, the Barbara Streisand CD. They gave us 10 minutes. We were lucky. 10 minutes to retrieve what we treasure most the toys, the photographs, the keepsakes. We shall rebuild the house, inshallah, but some things can never be replaced. What did we do to harm them? Why does the world allow them to hurt us so? We do not hate the Israeli people. We do not understand them. All we want is peace, but peace with justice. I cannot answer their questions. I can do nothing but stand with them, hold them, weep with them. We stand together, family and supporter, accompanied and accompanier. I'm sorry, I cannot offer you coffee. My house has been demolished. Thank you very much for listening to me. I greatly appreciate it. If I can answer any reasonable questions now, I would be only too delighted to do so. Thank you.
Any questions before?
Just a few moments to take it in.
Yeah.
What's your hope for the future?
My personal hope?
Yeah.
It's interesting you should ask me that question, because Janet asked me the same question this afternoon. It's an incredibly difficult question to answer. But a lot is happening to make people more aware than they've ever been of the realities of what is happening in Israel and Palestine. I believe there are many Israelis, and across the world now there are many Jews who are beginning to question some of the things that are happening. Israel has a very right-wing government now, and that has, I think, quite a significant impact on some of the things that have happened, like the incursion into Gaza in 2014, for example. Over 2,500 Palestinians lost their lives during that time, and my understanding is 550 plus of those were children. Many people who know nothing about Palestine and Israel questioned that, and I think it's quite a long way off now, unfortunately, because of Trump and things he's already said about his attitudes towards Israel and how much he supports Israel. And we get a very nominal support of the two-state solution in this country and in the EU. But to try and genuinely answer your question, I do believe that at some point in the future we will see a successful and acceptable solution to this. I just wish that the Israelis, my wish, and I have to speak on a personal level now, my wish is that Israel will recognise much more than it appears to be prepared to do at the moment, that the biggest barrier to a solution are the settlements and the settlers. There are other barriers, of course there are. Hamas and the military wing of Hamas, which is difficult. Rockets are still from time to time fired into Israel. In the house in Haifa I was privileged to go to, I saw one room that they had spent a lot of money reinforcing, especially in case there are rocket attacks. And I understand the fear that those Israeli people felt. But at the end of the day, I am convinced that the one thing that will in itself provide an answer is an agreement over the settlements. Until that happens, it will go nowhere. But the way that things are going now, I see a mirror image almost of what I saw happen in South Africa when I was a lot younger. I saw the world stand up and be counted after quite a long time. And I am beginning to experience that now among a lot of my friends and acquaintances and other organisations that I'm privileged to be involved in. And one day I think there will be sufficient pressure on both sides, but particularly Israel, to find a solution which is acceptable to both sides. I have no idea when that will be. I can't see it being in the immediate short term. I hope I've answered your question fairly. Yeah.
You showed mentioned the group that were in Sheikh Jarrah.
Yeah.
What do you know which group it was, and can you tell us anything more about the situation there and in Silwan? Because they're two places we hear bits about. But just your own experience of what's happening.
Many of the group who went to Sheikh Jarrah were also ladies who attended the Women in Black, but there were quite a significant number of male, because Women in Black is what it says it is. There were a few men, even with Women in Black. If you've been there, you'll know that. But there were quite a lot more men who went to the week. Is a weekly demonstration at Sheikh Jarrah. But Silwan is an altogether different problem. I had one meeting in Silwan where I got quite despairing of, because Silwan is an area of Jerusalem where many Palestinian homes have been taken over by Jewish settlers. There have been quite a number of occasions now where a Palestinian family might have gone to a wedding somewhere, for example, or the family for some reason or another is out for the day and Israeli settlers have moved into their home. And of course the Israeli military won't do anything to change that. And they change all the locks, they put special locking code things on their doors, and it really is a deeply disturbing thing that's happening there, and there seems to be more and more of it. And I also understand since I've left that a small mosque has also been demolished in Silwan since. Now, I'm not Muslim, but I feel deeply for the Muslim Palestinians, but I don't know how many of you know, but something like 50,000 Palestinians are Christian. I did have the great privilege of worshipping on a Sunday with a number of Palestinians in Arab-speaking services, sometimes shared English and Arabic. But we made a point as EAs of trying to go to church every Sunday. And for me, because of my Christian faith, going to places like St George's Cathedral, the Lutheran Church of the Redeemer, and on a Thursday we were always invited to the Sabile premises to take communion. They were very special times for me. They gave me the spiritual lift I needed sometimes when I felt really down. But don't ever think that all Palestinians are Muslims, and certainly don't ever think that all Palestinians are terrorists. There is unfortunately a small minority still today. Statistically, I've been led to understand that there are about 2% of Palestinians who still support a violent solution. And unfortunately, it's that small minority that do create, it's the image it tars for the rest, isn't it? It's like football supporters. Many times I've been to football matches where a small minority will tar the brush of the rest who are there. And I'm sorry to say there is a small minority of Palestinians who still seek a violent answer to the problem. So I think the lady in front was the first one to have her hand up, but I will then go to the other lady. Yeah.
It may not be an appropriate question for yourself, but there's so many United Nations conventions, etc., being broken in Israel-Palestine. I wonder, what the United Nations could do about it, and why aren't they doing any more? I don't know if that's appropriate for yourself, or if anybody else might have some kind of idea about why the United Nations are not doing more. They're just letting the lack.
I will do my absolute best to answer that question, but I'm speaking personally. I'm certainly not speaking for anything EAPPI or whoever. I've had too many experiences over the years. I worked in Slovenia and Croatia for 18 years and saw a disrespect for the UN because they found the UN to be toothless. And I'm sorry to say that is true also, my experience that is true also in Palestine and Israel. UN resolutions are all well and good, and we had an extraordinarily important resolution recently where the Americans made a decision to abstain from a vote rather than veto. And that was hugely significant, and it was to come up against the continued expansion of the Israeli settlements. But with respect to the United States, it was far, far too late to be making a gesture like that under the Obama regime. If Obama and John Kerry had really felt that strongly about the settlements, they should have been making that decision 2 years before, while they were still in authority and power. But they were probably afraid of the Jewish lobby in the States, which is extraordinarily strong. So, although I have deep respect for the theory of the UN, which I suspect anyone in this room might have, the blunt truth is that they have no teeth. And I think back to my time in Slovenia and Croatia, where they celebrated when the UN were pulled out of places like Sarajevo, and S4 they were called, went in, because S4 had much more ability to deal with the problems, and did. So I don't know what the answer is. I'm a great supporter of the principle of the UN, but no solution is ever going to come through the UN. I'm sorry to say. I hope I've answered your question fairly. The lady behind.
Yeah, we're talking about violence and that some sections of the Palestinian population turn to violence. Having been to Palestine, I'm continually amazed at the patience actually of Palestinians, and the level of violence is actually relatively little. And I think people should remember that under the Geneva Conventions, that they are an occupied people, and they are actually entitled to resist.
Yep, absolutely. Under the laws of occupation, that is their entitlement.
And if people came into our country and took part in our country, that would be the first thing that we would do, is to resist. Now, I personally hate violence, and I suppose for that reason I would urge people to join the BDS movement. If you really dislike violence, you'll turn to a non-violent way of influencing what's happening in Palestine. It isn't about delegitimizing Israel. It's about putting pressure on Israel to change and act in a humanitarian way.
I couldn't agree more with what I believe you just said. Unfortunately, we've got to a situation today where when people say the kind of things you just said, and some of the things that I've been saying, we're accused of being anti-Semitic. I find that deeply offensive, because my own Jewishness causes me to take great umbrage when people suggest that I'm anti-Semitic. But I have travelled a great deal in my working career. I'm retired now, in Russia, Belarus, and former Yugoslavia, and Romania, and obviously Palestine, Israel, etc. There is no people I've ever met who are more hospitable than the Palestinians. It never ceases to bowl my wife and I over the quite extraordinary hospitality we receive. And my experience now, and I've not been to Gaza, I want to stress that, but on the West Bank, the vast majority of Palestinians I've had the privilege of meeting and talking with are fully committed to a non-violent solution. Sadly, though, we get a very small minority of Palestinians who do commit some terrible acts. We had one a week ago last Sunday with the man who drove his lorry and killed 4 Israeli soldiers. When I was in Hebron, during my 3 months away, there was a young girl who was stabbed to death in her bedroom in her settlement. I heard of many stories like that. That's many. But sadly, in this country, what we don't hear are the deaths of the Palestinians in the same way. The reporting of the media in this country is totally disproportionate. I don't in any way, shape or form condone violence, and I cannot endorse the kind of action that was taken a week ago last Sunday when 4 Israeli soldiers were killed. I cannot. But what I also find very difficult to accept is that while I was there, for example, I knew an 8-month pregnant lady who was shot at the checkpoint because a soldier got nervous because he was driving his car towards her. I heard the story of a baker who went to work every morning at 4 o'clock in the morning, but at Calandia checkpoint was shot dead because a soldier got nervous about a car coming towards him. We heard a terrible story of a Palestinian who was shot dead, and then the pictures came on Facebook or something which showed an Israeli settler kicking a knife towards his body. But we rarely see or hear these things in the British press. There is something that is completely disproportionate, because something like 10 times the number of Israelis who are killed, 10 times more Palestinians are killed, and yet we rarely hear those stories.
And they never get justice, of course.
They very rarely get
Israelis
justice.
some sort of justice.
We had one situation recently, I think it was last year, where the most horrific thing had happened, where a Palestinian family were burned to death in their home on the West Bank by 3 Israeli settlers. One of them tried to claim some kind of temporary insanity, I think. But eventually, all 3 of them have gone to prison for extended periods. But they are so rare, aren't they? But I'm going to be really blunt there because I don't know what else to do. The number of times that we as EAs experienced terrible brutality occurring, and yet the police wouldn't even investigate it. Only something like 7% of cases are actually investigated by the Israeli police or the Israeli military. 7 out of 100. Goodness me. There's something really wrong with that, isn't there? Yes.
So Jimmy, how many EAs are you? How big is the organisation? And who do you see yourself answerable to, really?
Sorry, I missed the last bit you said.
Who are you answerable to?
Ultimately, we are answerable to the organisation that created the EAPPI programme, which is the World Council of Churches. For me personally, because of the way that the system works, I would probably be more accountable to the Quakers, because the delegation of the selection of EAs and our training is with the Quakers in this country. But EAPPI as an organisation, I should say, I hope it's helpful. Some of you may already know, EAPPI operates in about 25 countries across the world. And the number of people that go from the different countries as EAs varies enormously. The 2 most significant contributors, without doubt, are the UK and Ireland together and Sweden. And they're providing roughly half of the EAs who travel to the West Bank and East Jerusalem. The others are coming from the other 23 countries, some only one a year. But very strange thing about EAPPI is when you're there in placement, you are not allowed to serve with people from your own country. Very strict rule. So you do have a very interesting experience of 3 months in a placement flat with, in my case, 3 people who I didn't know from Adam, from 3 different countries. The basic rule is you have to be able to speak English. But, I mean, I was very lucky because the 3 people spoke excellent English. But I heard of other experiences of other groups where the English left a lot to be desired, and there was a lot of miscommunication and misunderstanding.
So how big was that group? How many of you were there? Just the 3 of you in the West Bank?
No, there were 4 of us in East Jerusalem. There were, in my group, there were another 5 placements on the West Bank itself. We'd actually had 16 people. But the group sizes vary a little bit, but very roughly, there's about 25 go each 3 months, very roughly. Yeah.
There were 3 quick things I wanted to mention. One was not all EAs are necessarily Christian, are they? There are some that are Jewish and some with no particular faith. Is that true?
Yeah. I don't know if you all heard that question. The question is basically about the EAs. We are not selected because primarily we are Christian. Yeah. It is a strict rule of the programme that you are selected on the basis of other criteria. I don't want to blow my own trumpet. They have to be confident that, one, you will be completely neutral in your approach to issues you will face, and that can be extraordinarily difficult. Believe me, it can. But also, it's how you handle yourself in a stressful situation. If you've got a settler who is harassing you, or a soldier, I mean, it happened to me one day, a soldier literally, as I was going through the Jaffa Gate, grabbed my arm and he yanked me back and demanded to see my passport and my visa, and then took a photograph of them. You have to be able to handle yourself in that sort of situation, and so part of the selection criteria is you do group activities, even an interview, to see how you react. But then it's made very clear that when you are selected for training, that's all you've been selected for.
Yeah.
You have to pass the training. Just because you're selected doesn't mean to say that you will go. And there are occasions where people have failed the training and have not gone. So it's really important to understand that I had 2 weeks of really intensive training, believe me. Not only about international law and humanitarian law, etc., but also about handling ourselves in some quite difficult circumstances. And they really did test us during the training in that regard. So,
just 2 quick points. I was going to mention when you were talking about violence and the lack of reporting, quite a number of people here probably know about the figures that are produced almost daily but on a website called EAPPI Palestine. It's actually a New Zealand guy. But that details everything that's happened in a 24-hour period. And when you see the amount of home invasions, arrests, abductions, all sorts of things, you never hear anything about those in our local press. And, you know, if those figures were actually reported in this country, that people would actually see them, it was staggering.
I don't know if you heard that, but I would add that quite a lot of the information that forms part of that reporting is what the EAs have done. Not all, not by any means, but every day when we got back to our placement, part of our work was to actually prepare reports of what had happened that day. So whether we had been at house demolitions, or we'd visited Bedouin community, or we'd witnessed a violent act, because unfortunately, quite regularly while we were there, we saw unacceptable behaviour by Israeli military and more often Israeli settlers, because the Israeli military and the police do work within some ground rules. So you could be more confident of how you dealt with that. But unfortunately, by far the most difficult people to deal with were the Israeli settlers, because they had no ground rules.
Thank you.
Can I just ask about the settlers? Is it possible to say where the majority of the settlers are coming from?
A very interesting question. I can answer that question.
Are they new immigrants to Israel?
All the time. But I remember, not when I was there as an EA, but twice when I've been there on previous occasions, I've met with an English journalist by the name of Jonathan Cook. There's a lot of nods and yeses. Jonathan is an amazing man to meet. He lives up in Nazareth, married to a Palestinian, dare I say, an Arab Israeli. I mean, I find that terrible, but not acknowledging that she is in fact Palestinian. But I met with him one day, and he said to me, Paul, he said, how many different nationalities do you think now make up Israel? And I said, I don't know. I'm thinking about the Ukraine and Russia and places like that where they're coming from, Ethiopia and like 25? He said no. He said he's 82. Astonishing statistic. But that comes from a man who knows his onions, so I feel I can trust in that number. But 82 different nationalities now make up what we know as Israel. And all the time there are more and more people, because I don't know how aware you are, but the Israeli government is set on not allowing any greater proportion of Palestinians than already exists, either Arab Israelis or Palestinians. So they cannot be more. Currently there are about 39% of the total population, but Israel wants that figure to be 30. So that is one of the reasons for the house demolitions. It is one of the reasons why, if extensions are built to homes because the family want their children have grown up and want to have their own family, they're not allowed to build their own home, so they try and take the risk of building an extension to a home, but then that gets recognised and that gets demolished. It's to try and drive the figures down. And often when Arab Israelis are punished, how are they punished? They can either be sent to the West Bank, get them out of Israel, or worse, some are sometimes sent to Gaza. And that's fact. But it's a much smaller proportion are sent into Gaza. They have to have done something really bad. But nonetheless, Israel is seeking to try and drive down that proportion so that it can maintain the demographics. I think genuinely, I think this gentleman was first hand I saw.
It might seem slightly off topic, but I don't think it is. The Israeli government, army and settlers are all to a differing speed working on the principle that God gave us this land. Back them into a corner, that's what they'll say. Now, if as a Christian you open the book of Joshua and start reading about the arrival of Moses and then Joshua into the, and I quote, promised land, you find pretty much the same doctrine being put forward. And I personally think that's one reason why the cause of the Palestinians is so difficult to argue in Britain, because far too many people remember the Old Testament or bits of it. Now, is there some sort of reinterpretation going on over there, which we might learn from over here?
Unfortunately, what you've said fundamentally is correct. There is a very large proportion of the Israeli population now who believe that it is their land. The Palestinians shouldn't be there at all. They need to be driven out completely. That is particularly true with the settlers, is my experience. But if this makes some sort of sense, because there are more and more people moving into Israel from these 82 countries, many of them are going to live on the West Bank in the settlements. But then they have to serve in the military, or in the police, or the border guards. That means there's an ever-increasing number of military or Israeli security forces of some kind are settlers. So that means there's an ever-growing proportion of the people who say, this is our land. We need to drive the Palestinians out. We don't want them here. And unfortunately, because I'm talking to a certain extent about some of my own friends and family, particularly some of my friends, they condone this behaviour. I have Christian friends who seem unable to recognise the reality of the scriptures that I've referred to, particularly the one in Matthew 25. I've actually had Christian friends who have said to me, the Israelis can do what they like, because it's their land. And that kind of Christian Zionism is especially strong in the United States. And they have a huge impact on the vote, the election of a new, my understanding is the election of Trump was partly came about, only partly, but partly came about because of Christian Zionists in the southern states of America. So, irrespective of how you see it, there is an extremely strong Christian lobby in the world which supports that the Israelis can do what they like because it is their land.
This is where Sabil's work with looking at the scriptures is so important with the churches in Palestine, so that Palestinian Christians can realise and understand that the scriptures are not saying that.
Yeah.
And I think that's where their Bible study groups, their educational projects and so on are so important.
Yeah.
And it always makes me sad that Christians have got stuck in the Old Testament. I mean, it's what's the word, a paradox, isn't it, that they're still stuck in looking at Old Testament thinking.
The more important words should be those of our Lord and Saviour, not... there are probably non-Christians here, so I apologise for... No, I won't apologise. I won't apologise for my faith, but I will just say that sometimes I would express a view that is because of my Christian faith.
Cool, just a couple more questions to give people time to look at the stores.
I was just going to ask, is the number of EAs, is that restricted by the Israeli government?
That's a really big question.
Because the more peacekeepers, because obviously where you are, it seems that there's perhaps more peace.
I can only answer your question honestly. The group that I went in with, we don't really know why, but there should have been 25 of us. But the Israeli authorities at immigration identified 5 of us and turned them straight round and sent them home. So our group was immediately reduced to 20, which made it quite difficult for us to man the different placements. We had to have a major reorganisation and restructuring. When I was in Jerusalem, public enemy number 1 of the Israeli state was without doubt breaking the silence, who I mentioned earlier. The Israeli military have come out. But unfortunately, public enemy number 2 became the EAPPI. The organisation I was with. Some of the things that were being said at public meetings, we went to one. They didn't know we didn't wear our jackets, but because it was an international meeting, they were talking in English. And some of the things that were being said about the EAs were absolute drivel. And we felt like getting up and saying, ran, you know. But you couldn't, because you would have identified yourself, and unfortunately the likelihood is that you would have been turned out. You'd have found yourself being sent home. I've been warned now that I'm likely to have been blacklisted. Certainly the 4 people who were together in Jerusalem, 3 of those from other countries have been blacklisted. And I can't write to the Israeli embassy and say, am I blacklisted? Because the first thing they're going to say, hey, what? You know, and they're going to try and find out why I'm asking the question. So it's going to be a little while before I can think about going back again. Otherwise, I would have been going back in April with a particular program that I've been part of for a long time now with an organisation called the Amos Trust.
So just give me some, women in black, is it, in their selection?
Sorry, I missed that.
The women were called the women in black.
The women in black are the Israeli peace actors. Yeah. So I think for Dave's sake we should probably draw a line. I hope I've done my absolute best to answer your questions, but it would be lovely if you could have a little look at the stuff that's out there, and I just thank you for your interest and your questions. It's been very challenging for me to think about some of the answers. But
thank you very much.